Hello, and welcome to Religion and Life. I am your host, Ozzie Ostwalt, and this week we'll be focusing on biblical research and its relevance to modern life. Our guest, award-winning author Dr. Davis Hankins, will be joining the conversation as we talk about his newest publication on the biblical book of Job. Welcome, Dr. Hankins. It's a pleasure having you here.
It's good to be here. Thanks.
So not only are you a new author, and we have a copy of your book here, the book of Job and the Imminent Genesis of Transcendence.
Yeah.
It's a wonderful book. So congratulations.
Thank you.
But also congratulations because it's an award-winning book. This book won the Lautenschlager Award for Theology, and that is a very prestigious award for religious studies. Could you tell us a little bit about the award itself and how that all came about?
Sure, I'll be happy to. It's an award that has been given for over 10 years. Actually over 11 years. It's been given 10 times. It was John Templeton funded award, and then Manfred Lautenschlager funded it, each for 5 years. So this is the end of the Lautenschlager funding, and the award may continue, but it's not clear where. Like there's no award next year. It may be in future years that they continue it. So I'm very grateful to have gotten it. It was an amazing experience. I got to go to Heidelberg. The award is housed at this Interdisciplinary and International Research Center at the University of Heidelberg in Germany. So I had never been there, and it's given to 10 junior faculty members from all over the world. And so I was there with 9 other folks who have written great books, and I got to learn a lot, and in all sorts of different facets of religious studies. So there were other folks who are biblical scholars, but that was by no means all of them. There were some who worked on 20th century Catholic theology, and others who work on rabbinic Judaism, and so it's from all over. And that was in all, I mean, a wonderful experience. We all gave papers about our next projects to one another. So when we got to spend a lot of time over several days and many meals, and it was very, I feel very fortunate to have gotten the award and had the experience, because
well, it's an amazing way to start a career. I mean, you're publishing your first book and you win this prestigious award. I guess I ask where you go from here. I mean, what does this mean for the rest of your career? Does it put pressure on you or give you momentum, or both?
I think both. I mean, it puts me in conversation with a number of other junior faculty members who have produced really great work, and I think those relationships will kind of carry forward in some helpful ways. And it does give me momentum to get my next projects out and be in contact with a number of folks I wouldn't have contacted without the award. So,
very good.
Yeah.
Well, tell me a little bit about the book. How did you come to write about the book of Job?
I went to Emory University for my Ph.D. and I went there because for a number of reasons, but primarily because I wanted to work with Carol Newsom, who is close to retirement now, but she is a goddess as far as I'm concerned. And
she's certainly a well-known name in biblical studies.
Yes, she is. And she wrote a groundbreaking book on the book of Job in 2003. And I started off thinking that I was going to write on the lament Psalms. So in some ways, I think there's a lot of overlap between Psalms of Lament and Job. Both are poetic, mostly poetry, and for the book of Job, and poems that are filled with lamentation and grief. And so I think I'm attracted to those sort of darker parts of the Bible, and I eventually shifted my focus to work on Job, but that's not actually what I thought I was going to write on at first.
Right. Well, some of our viewers may not know the plot line of Job. Maybe you could just briefly tell us what this story is and what it's about.
Sure, yeah, I'd be glad to. It begins with a prose tale that reads like a folk story. It begins by referring to Job as the wisest and wealthiest man who lived a long time ago far in the East, and so it begins very much like a folk tale. And in the first few verses, this man who's the wisest, supposedly wealthiest, most pious, fear of God, loses about everything that he has, and then he has a couple of very enigmatic statements, some of which are well known, like naked I came to the earth, and naked I shall depart.
Right.
And then so it's unclear how he's responding to these awful traumatic disasters that befall him, the death of his children, loss of all of his property, and even his own body begins to react against him. And then in the third chapter, it transitions into poetry, and it remains poetic up until through chapter 41. And there are several different parts, but the gist of it is, at first, Job and three so-called friends argue, dispute, have dialogue about Job's experience, along with many other topics about the nature of human being, about the earth, about God. And then there are a couple of other sections, but the big sort of climax of the book occurs in chapters 38 through 41, where God finally shows up in response to this dispute and in the whirlwind, in the tempest, and begins to speak about both inanimate creation, the watercourses and the stars and so on.
So you say, so God finally shows up at the end of this tale.
Right.
He's absent throughout most of the story.
Well, he's there at the beginning, and he has this, he celebrates Job's piety in the heavens.
Right.
It's like a cross-cut film where we have a scene in heaven and a scene on earth, and then a scene in heaven and a scene on earth. And God celebrates Job's piety, but he has this sort of prosecuting attorney in the divine council who is called the Satan, and of course later that will get identified with the devil figure. But at this point, it is in history, this is the accuser is what it means literally. And he says, well, I don't know, Job has so much stuff, you've kind of fenced him off from the real world, so let's take away the stuff and see how much whether he fears God and or curses you then. And so God and Satan sort of hand in hand remove everything from Job, including his own body.
It's an unusual partnership.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. Yeah. And then God is silent for 35 chapters until chapter 38, where God shows up in the whirlwind and seems to speak about nothing related to Job and what the friends and Job have been having a dialogue about. And it sounds very accusatory and harsh language. Were you there when I created the world?
Right.
And a lot of those sort of direct addresses to Job that sound admonitory. And then in the final chapter of the book, Job makes again an enigmatic response to God, where and then that follows by a short little prose section where God surprisingly says that Job has spoken what's right about God, the friends have not. And then Job, we're told, begins to flourish both in his property, and he has a family. We're told about sons and daughters, and the community sort of gathers around him at the center at the end of the book.
So he's justified in the end, in a sense. I mean, his belief in God, or his piety, his faithfulness stands the test.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's questionable to what extent does Job remain pious or not, but at least God endorses what Job has said, including some very sort of offensive, what we would consider probably impious remarks. Well,
one of the things my students, and I'm sure you hear this too, always ask is, what does this story, it's so old, it's so ancient, what does it have to do with my life? Is it relevant anymore? How do you respond? And you do respond in this book, I think. Talking about the relevance of this book, what does it mean today? What can we take from it?
Well, I think that there's a ton that this book speaks to in terms of, on the one hand, kind of universal questions about what does it mean to be a human being? How do we deal with trauma and suffering? Who is God, and how is God related to the world and human reality? And then how do humans relate to one another, and how do human beings respond to the suffering of others? And so I think that some of the most pressing sort of human questions about suffering, desire, meaning, the meaning of life, these are all questions of the book of Job that are at the center of the book of Job, and I think we can learn a lot by engaging it.
So these are universal questions of humanity. It doesn't matter whether the book was written thousands of years ago or yesterday. They're addressing the same kind of central existential concerns.
And I think that that's apparent as well. And when you look at the number of philosophers and novelists and other writers who have engaged the book of Job and drawn on the book of Job as it continues to speak to concerns and issues.
So one of the things that some critics have said about your book is that you work in an interdisciplinary fashion. You're really drawing methods from biblical studies, religious studies, philosophy, and maybe even the psychoanalytic tradition. How do you weave these different methods into an analysis of literature, and what does that bring to the study of a work like this?
Yeah, I think that is something that sets my book apart in some ways from others, is that I do look to contemporary philosophical conversations, as well as conversations among psychoanalysts about human subjectivity, desire, and I look to sort of new developments in understanding what is matter, what is the kind of new materialisms, and from them I draw concepts and categories that helped me rethink some of what you find in the book of Job, so that a number of things that are said about the book among biblical scholars seem to me off about what you actually find in the book, in light of rethinking it on the basis of new developments in philosophical and psychoanalytic thought.
Right. So just listening to you talk about the book, and I've read most of it, it's a heady book. It's heavy duty. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts about who your audience is. I mean, would the typical parishioner in the local church pick up this book and gain from it, or is this more of a specialized audience of graduate students or professors?
Well, I wrote it as, at first, this isn't exactly like the dissertation version, but I wrote it as a dissertation, so I think the primary audience at first was my dissertation committee. And yet I think the book, my book, is asking much deeper questions that I think many people are interested in the topics. My wife was speaking at a church a while back, and one of the church members, I accompanied her, and one of the church members came and brought me the book and asked me to sign it, which is the first and only time that that's ever happened. So I apparently at least one person has purchased the book and read it, and she said she was enjoying it. But it is, there's a good bit of sort of technical jargon and language in there. I think the book series that it's published in from Northwestern University Press is a philosophy and psychoanalysis series, so it's not actually published in either a dissertation series or in a series that's primarily targeted for biblical scholars. So my hope was that it would be great to get some biblical scholarship and deep engagement with biblical texts in front of some contemporary philosophers, and my hope is that the biblical scholars would find the book no matter where it was published, because they're interested in the book of Job.
Well, it's a wonderful book. I mean, you're not only an author and a teacher, but I want to talk about another aspect of your work as well. We've got a couple of photographs here that you've been that you've shared with us, and you do some archaeological work. If we can see those photographs of you on site, you do archaeological work, and could you tell us a little bit about that and how that informs your work? I believe we have one here. Can you tell us where you are right here?
Yeah, so this is in the Fayum region of Egypt. I was able, actually, at the award in Heidelberg, because they were flying me to Germany, I was able to extend the trip, and I went down to Egypt, where I had never been before, and I wasn't actually doing archaeological work, but my next project will draw heavily on archaeological as well as other evidence for this time period when, after Alexander the Great, when Greek rulers were ruling in Egypt and Syria and Mesopotamia and in Greece. And so there's a period, that period is the Ptolemaic period, because the Ptolemies, this is the family that the famous Cleopatra would come from in Egypt, were ruling, and they controlled the territories in Syria, Palestine. So my next project will draw deeply on the evidence that we have for changes that occurred during the Ptolemaic period, many of which are evident in Egypt. And so that's what I was looking into while there, but also I think came to influence the development of early Jewish thought and the folks the Jews in Judea. And, Yeah.
Well, let's look at this next photograph, one that I'm particularly fond of. It looks like you're investigating. Yeah, you're in a. It does look kind of Indiana Jones-ish. What are you doing here?
Oh, I'm afraid of bats.
Oh, you're
here.
okay.
I'm very afraid. I know mentally they weren't going to fly into me, but I was, as they were flying around me, I was a bit scared. So, yeah, that picture kind of captures that well. Here, I'm looking around in some catacombs in Rome. It was also part of the same trip. I spent 6 days in Egypt and then 6 days in Italy, and we're looking at a number of things, but all related to the same sort of project.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, it's a fascinating part of your work, and I'm glad you're going to be able to do more of this as you look forward to, as you mentioned, your next work. And I'd like to hear about that, actually. I think you've mentioned that your next big project, I know you're publishing all the time, but your next book project will be on another biblical book, Ecclesiastes. Can you tell us a little bit about how that project's headed, where it's headed, how it's going?
Sure, I'd be happy to. This is, Ecclesiastes is often closely associated with the book of Job and the biblical book of Proverbs, and they are referred to as part of this larger wisdom tradition, beginning earlier in Israel and then continuing throughout, even through New Testament period and into the Common Era. So, but at the same time, the book of Ecclesiastes is a very strange book. I'm sure that you know. In the context of the Bible, it is really very unlike the rest of the literature that we find in the biblical canon. And so, as I'm working on with a friend and a colleague from graduate school who's now also a professor named Brennan Breed. He and I were working on a commentary together, and we started asking about how is it that a book like this could arise in the history of Jewish thought. And
before you go further, can you give me an example of something that's you said is unusual or odd in the history of Jewish thought that might surprise someone or that sets Ecclesiastes apart?
Sure. The motto verse for the book at the beginning and the end is vanity, famously translated,
yes.
Vanity of vanities, all is vanity, and there's nothing new under the sun, and this strong concern, deep concern with death, and death as something that sort of equalizes all people. Almost sounds like existential philosophy, where death is this great equalizer. You don't take anything with you to the grave, and you have no idea what happens to you after death. Don't believe anybody who tells you you're going up or down because you don't know. And
you really are drawn to the dark books, aren't you?
Yeah, I am. And it's an amazing piece of literature that again is very different from other things that we find at the time it's written, as well as earlier traditions of Jewish thought. But at the same time, those other traditions, which are very different from Ecclesiastes, that are emerging at the same time as Ecclesiastes, are also very bizarre. So this is the time period, and the time period when I think Ecclesiastes is written is the same time that you get the rise of apocalyptic thought in Jewish circles, which certainly has some antecedents, but in many ways is a whole new way of speculating about the divine world and angels and demons and all of these things that emerge and become important in early Christianity and in developing Judaism. But
and just to clarify, apocalyptic thought has to do with the end of time and God's judgment at the end, and that's a different genre that comes into the literature.
Right.
Yeah.
But at this same time, so Brennan and I started to wonder about why is it that these very strange ways of speaking and thinking, strange within the context of the history of Jewish thought, why is it that they emerge in this one century, which is the century when the Ptolemies were ruling Egypt? And in Palestine at the time, and this is in the 3rd century BCE, so the 200s, and Palestine, you don't see people, even though they're controlled by Greek rulers, you don't see people building homes with Corinthian columns, and you don't see them wearing Greek dress, or you don't even see a lot of Greek language in this century. So a lot of the things that biblical scholars pay close attention to as markers of cultural influence don't appear in this century, but Brennan and I have found that there does seem to be a widespread influence from the Greek rulers in Egypt on their provinces that they're ruling. It's just not in the ways that biblical scholars usually pay attention to. So there's not a lot of attention to these changes in biblical scholarship when there's not a lot of attention to this period in biblical scholarship. And yet, Brennan and I think, so what started out as a investigation into the historical context of Ecclesiastes has turned into now a whole book that Brennan and I will write on this period, and its import for the development of Jewish thought, and it'll be in the context of that book that we'll then be able to situate our reading of Ecclesiastes.
Well, I'm getting the sense now of what your research is like. It really is interdisciplinary, bringing in philosophy and culture to biblical studies. It's creative in that you're adding a different dimension. You're coming at some of this work from a different angle, and that seems to be the groundbreaking part of what you're doing here. So, gosh, I expect to see many great books coming from your pen in the future.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I enjoy my scholarship a lot, and this project right now is much more historical than the Job project was, and so in many ways that's a lot of fun for me too.
Well, we look forward to seeing it and many more. You're a valued member of our faculty. Our students love you in the Department of Philosophy and Religion, so we thank you for your good work.
Thanks.
And thanks for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Sure.
Great.
Well, thank you for joining us on Religion and Life, brought to you by App TV. And we'd like to thank Dr. Davis Hankins, our guest today, for stopping by. On the next episode of Religion and Life, we'll be discussing the fiction of Randall Keenan with Professor Bruce Dick. We hope you join us then. Until next time, this is Ozzie Ostwalt.